Now it's Politics Live.
It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
You could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension systems, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian.
The head of NATO gives a stark warning about what could happen if we don't increase defence spending. Is he right? Also,
the Chancellor, and I think she's right about this, is not going to apologise for a series of measures she took to stabilise the nation's finances when we came into office.
After yesterday's U-turn, ministers won't apologise for cutting winter fuel payments in the first place.
To bring it back is good news. It's just a pity they don't back pay it.
I think it's good that they've admitted they're wrong, but it should have happened earlier.
Dr. David Bull.
Reform UK has a new chairman. The last one quit the role after one of the party's MPs called for the burqa to be banned. We're joined by that MP, Sarah Pochin, in the studio. And should dads get more time off work when their children are born? Joining me, Labour MP Sarah Owen, Shadow Housing Secretary Kevin Honinrake, and alongside Reform UK's Sarah Pochin is Kieran Stacey from The Guardian. This is Politics Live. So let's start with those comments that we heard there in the headlines from Mark Rutte, the Secretary-General of NATO. He was talking at Chatham House yesterday and he was urging allies to spend more on defence. And he warned of the possibility of an attack by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's have a listen to a little bit more of what he had to say.
If you do not do this, if we would not go to the 5%, including the 3.5% core defence spending, you could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension systems, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian.
So a pretty stark warning there, Sarah. Do you think it's right to spend more on defence, and should it go up to 3%?
I think that is a very stark warning. There'll be one person that will be cheerleading that, and that, of course, will be Nigel Farage. I mean, he could probably get some more thousands from Russian television if that's the case. But on a serious note, this is a really scary place the world is in at the moment. And I think that the UK's commitment to NATO is the right one. It is an ever-changing landscape, politically, economically, and in terms of the level of threat. So I think it is the right thing to do.
Kevin, do you agree?
I agree we should spend more on defence. Quite clearly, we set out a path to get to 3% of GDP in terms of spend by the end of this Parliament. So it's right, the direction of travel is that way. I'm concerned where the government is right now. At the moment, it's got a spending review for defence that needs 3% of GDP, yet the Chancellor and the Prime Minister has only committed 2.5%, and they've got an ambition to get to 3% by the end of 2034.
Actually, Mark Rutte's calling for even more than that.
He is, but nevertheless, there's a direction of travel here, but you've got at least to get to the 3%, and there's no plan, no even definite target to get to 3%, even before the end of the next Parliament by the current government. That pathway is far too slow. We definitely need to step up our spending on defence to mitigate some of these problems.
I'm sorry, Kevin, I'm not going to take any lectures from a previous Conservative minister who left shipyards to rack and ruin, from Appledore to Plymouth to Govan. They had no plan at all for shipbuilding and industry in this country. And what we are seeing is going to have 30,000 skilled jobs. We have a plan to take this forward. Of course, NATO are going to ask for more money. That is the job of the General Secretary of NATO, to be asking for more money.
But your numbers don't add up,
but your numbers were non-existent.
Oh,
I listened. I was sat on Public Accounts Committee. We asked about the defence spending plan, and there was no plan.
We spent over 2% of GDP.
There was no plan.
There was no plan.
You couldn't tell me the priorities for what you're going to spend on.
Don't talk over each other. All the way through those 14 years. Clearly, the threats now are heightened. The point being now, you've got a defence review that's calling for, it's predicated on 3% of GDP spend. You're only spending 2.5%. That's the reality.
From a Conservative minister who cut the army to its lowest levels.
Let's bring in Kieran here. I mean, this is the debate, isn't it? That there's these added pressures now on the budgets. Do any of the parties have an answer of how they're going to pay for this?
Well, I mean, you say this is the debate. I'm actually not seeing a huge amount of debate there because I don't think there's a huge difference between the two parties. I mean, Kevin says, how are you going to pay for it? Labour said exactly the same to the Tories while they were in power. there's not actually that much questioning of what is the right level of defence spending. We've already seen it ramped up from 2 to 2.5. Now there's an ambition to get to 3, as Kevin says. Now we're talking about 3.5. There's very little scrutiny of why those figures are being bandied around. And I think Sarah's right. You know, you would expect the Secretary-General of NATO to make exactly this case. I would view this as special pleading in the same way that nurses will special plead for funding for the NHS, or house building companies will special plead for house building funds. Everybody has a stake in government spending and they want their little bit of the pie. I'm not sure we should necessarily take Mark Rutte's comments any more seriously than we would any other sector of the economy.
Do you agree with that? Let's bring Sarah in here.
I haven't spoken yet. So what I'd like to say, how fascinating that the Labour representative on this programme today took exactly 2 seconds to mention the name Nigel Farage, which is all Labour seems to be able to do at the moment. The Tory and the Tory and the Labour member, you've had your say, then proceed to argue over this matter. The fact is, the first role of government is to protect its people. We are not war ready. Times have changed, and neither of these administrations have got this country in a position where we can defend ourselves.
So what is the right amount of spending?
It's at least 3%. But the point is, how are these two going to pay for it? The Tories spent 14 years ignoring this problem, whilst, incidentally, whilst the Ukraine war started, we had war in Europe, and you were doing nothing about it.
How would you pay for it? How would you pay for it?
So we would go for at least 3%, and we have talked about all of the savings that we would make through binning some of the net zero projects, the white elephants costing this country millions, and divert this spending into defence spending. Because, as I said at the beginning, that is the first role of this government, and times have changed. We've had years of peace.
We'll come back to your spending plans in a second.
But anyway, let's get back to the point you made. We did nothing on Ukraine. That is a complete nonsense.
I didn't say
we
that.
were the first country to go in and support Ukraine and Zelensky.
No, I didn't say that. I said you've done nothing about getting
let him answer the point about Ukraine.
No, that's not true. We spent more than the required amount that NATO recommends in terms of GDP spend. That's reality. Of course the threats are changing. Of course that's the case. And the threats have changed, so we've stepped up how much we're spending, and that pathway to 3% by 20... No, you made your point. You made your point. 20 to 2029. And the point is there is a difference. That's why we're arguing. Labour have not got a plan to get to 3% by 2029. We have. Of course, the army, the nature of our defence...
You should have done this, Kevin. You should have been doing
so
this.
So easy to say.
And it's so easy for you to now say it in opposition. But the point is, you should have been looking ahead. Ukraine war...
So the easiest job in the world to stand on the sidelines and criticise. That's what you always do.
Which is what you're doing now.
You've got so much spending.
Which is what you're doing now.
We've been there, Sarah. We've been there for 14 years and taken those difficult decisions through COVID, through Brexit, through the cost of living crisis, all competing pressures. You've had none of those pressures yet.
You've let our army reduced to barely nothing. We cannot defend ourselves anymore. We've got enough drones for one day's warfare compared to the amount that Ukraine are currently using. How have you let that happen over 14 years?
Because we've been supplying with Ukraine with a huge amount of weaponry.
You could have done more.
As you know.
You could have done more.
Let's move on, and just to remind you not to talk over each other, because people don't like that when they can't hear what you're saying. Yesterday, we discussed the government's U-turn on winter fuel. What it will mean is that those earning £35,000 or less will get it back this winter. Now, in the afternoon in the Commons, the Pensions Minister, Torsten Bell, set out the details of the reversal, and he was facing questions from the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Helen Whately. Let's have a listen.
Just 4 weeks ago, I stood here and I asked him how long this tone-deaf final stand could go on for. Loyally, he held the line. He defended the cut one final time. He said their plan for pensioners was right on track. Well, today, Madam Deputy Speaker, he has been sent to end that courageous last stand. And, unless it's coming next, he has been sent without the one thing that pensioners up and down the country deserve, an apology.
The Honourable Lady talks about apology. She comes here as the party of Liz Truss and lectures anybody else about apology. She comes here as the party of flatlining wages, rising debt, 200,000 increase in pensioner poverty, and asks anybody else to apologise. I've never heard such nonsense. And then for all the sound of fury, she was on her most furious today, but we've listened to pensioners. We've also listened to her just now, and I still can't tell what their policy is.
Well, Sarah, would it be better just for the government to apologise for that original decision to deprive millions of pensioners of that winter fuel payment?
I think most people just want it to get right, and to get it right, and to not worry about this.
And do you think it is right now?
I think it is better than it was, absolutely. There's many people that can't argue with the idea of mean testing it. The idea that someone like Alan Sugar, for example, gets winter fuel allowance is for the birds when people are really struggling. But what I want to see is actually tackling the issue of high costs of energy anyway. Since the energy crisis, the top 20 energy companies have made over £500 billion worth of profits. That's record profits off the backs of people that cannot afford to switch the lights on. That is not the way that we should be having our country run. And it's certainly not good enough for pensioners, and it's certainly not good enough for people on low incomes either. So I'm glad that the government have listened. I'm glad
the argument they've made is
rise.
that the economy has been stabilised since last year.
Yeah.
Is that really credible?
I think it is, in terms of looking
Based
at
on
it.
what?
It's one of the fastest growing economies in the G7, ahead of Canada, ahead of the US, ahead of Germany. Those are major players in the world stage, and we're ahead of them. So I think it has stabilised. Of course, we want to see it go in faster in that direction.
But the OBR has said in its March fiscal outlook that at the time of the spring statement that the underlying fiscal outlook has deteriorated since October.
I think, obviously, we have a huge mountain to climb. We're not going to turn that tank around like that,
Shouldn't Rachel Reeves just have
unfortunately.
said, look, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done it in the first place?
I think she's tied herself to those fiscal rules. She was honest about that, saying we had to take some difficult decisions. Those are the difficult decisions she's taken and that the government has taken. And I think it's right that we reassess that. And I think it is good when a government actually looks at themselves and says, we could do better, and this year we will be.
Kevin, talking of apologies, there's a lot of people talking and wanting apologies. What about apologising for Liz Truss's mistakes? We heard from your colleague Mel Stride last week, and he showed some contrition, but he wouldn't say sorry. Chris Philp at the weekend wouldn't say sorry. You're not saying sorry either.
I'm happy to say sorry. I was against Liz Truss taking over in the first place. I thought Rishi Sunak would be a far better Prime Minister. Listen, in terms of the actual issue, the winter fuel allowance, the day I heard that announced on the floor of the Commons, it was a U-turn waiting to happen. It's taken too long, but finally it's back, and I'm pleased it's back. You've got to welcome that, because a lot of people really did suffer last winter as a result. But to somehow claim the economy is in a better position, unemployment is up, inflation is up, debt is up, the OBR forecast for the economic growth is down. It is a complete nonsense. One thing we should all do in politics, and as you say, I've just apologised for something else. If you get something wrong, just say you're sorry, and then hopefully people will move on. But it was just a gigantic political mistake.
Well, you have apologised for Liz Truss's mini-budget, and none of your colleagues in the shadow cabinet have done that.
Well, I can't speak for them. For me, you better just make a clean breast of it. Clearly, what Liz did, I'm sure she'd hoped her strategy would work. It was doomed to failure. You cannot simply borrow without end before you've spoken to the people who are going to lend you the money. Any household knows that. Any business knows that. It was the wrong thing to do. Water under the bridge, as far as I'm concerned. You've got to look forward. There are lots of reasons.
But you're happy to apologise as a member of the Shadow Cabinet?
Kevin, you didn't say that at the time.
Yeah, I did.
You didn't come out and say it, did you?
Yes, I did.
You did?
Yes, I did. You
Okay.
can check back.
So maybe your party should learn from that.
Well, I asked the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions to what they're going to do to support pensioners on winter fuel allowance and pensioners that are struggling with their energy costs, and he answered it. So I guess maybe then Kevin and I have done what we needed to do in terms of being able to
I don't think your party's apologised.
in terms of that. Well, his party hasn't apologised, but ultimately I think we're scrapping about a word sorry, and what's really mattering here is that there are going to be millions more pensioners that are going to be better off this winter, and there's also the triple lock on state pensions as well, has been promised.
Kieran, it has been a reversal, but it is still unfunded, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah.
Rachel Reeves is saying that she will tell us how much, how she's going to pay for it. But is that a problem for her, an unfunded spending pledge? She's made a lot about other parties doing that.
Well, a problem with whom, I think, is the question. What is the point of being so strict about your fiscal rules? Actually, there's only one point, which is to keep the markets happy. If you can keep your debt costs low, then you've essentially achieved what you want to do with those rules. I don't see any sign in the markets of kind of bond yields suddenly spiking or the bond markets freaking out because she's just announced.
It's a relatively small amount of money.
It's a relatively small amount of money, but also I don't think people are interpreting this, at the moment anyway, as a signal that there's a lot more spending to come. which was, by the way, the problem with Liz Truss. It wasn't even just the mini-budget. It was the fact that Kwasi Kwarteng went out over that next weekend and said there's more to come. So a lot of this is to do with signals to the market, and traders will pick up on that.
There's more tax and more spend to come. We all know it.
Well, I mean, there may well be more taxes to come, or there's going to have to be more cuts to something else, maybe welfare to come later on this year.
Sarah, the Prime Minister, talking about your party's policy, said that Nigel Farage would crash the economy and actually compared reform to Liz Truss, saying he was Liz Truss Mark II. What do you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is you asked Sarah there about the winter fuel U-turn. I've just fought the by-election in Runcorn and Helsby, and one of the biggest issues on the doorstep was the winter fuel allowance being taken away. So clearly what's happened is Labour, again, are listening to reform policies, U-turning. They've introduced it because they lost the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, and hence here I am sat here today. So the point is they have listened to us again. Sarah also mentioned the fact that we need to have a robust energy policy in this country. Well, why aren't the Labour government and the Tories government also failed to do it, investing and getting our own gas out the ground? Why aren't we using our own oil out the ground? No, Sarah, you've had your say. The point is we could be self-sufficient in energy. We're just bringing nuclear on board. But to be fair, that's been a Tory policy that the Labour are now talking about today. We have to be self-sufficient. And the Ed Miliband nonsense of is...
But you're in favour of nuclear power, are you?
Which is very much in favour of
So that's the big announcement today from the government.
But my point is, Labour are claiming that as theirs. Well, clearly that's taken years to get underway. We are absolutely... What Reform are in favour of is making us energy self-sufficient, so we don't end up in this situation. As regards to the U-turn, well, it's just going to be one of many. And as regards how they're going to pay for it, there's going to be an awful lot of upset in the markets because already those markets are unhappy.
How are you going to pay for all the nuclear, Sarah? How are you going to pay for all the nuclear?
Well, we have talked about... We don't know every single costing element of our policy.
Yeah, but you do have to...
4 years out. The point is
but you do have to answer broad questions, Sarah, about this, because you have a lot of policies, including lifting the income tax threshold to £20,000. I mean, that will cost billions and billions of pounds.
It will. But as we quite clearly said, and we have talked about how we're going to cost it. We've been talking about it for the last
50 billion
weeks.
pounds it's going to cost,
so,
at least?
For example, we've costed scrapping the net zero projects over the next 5 years will bring in £225 billion.
That's very much disputed by a lot of the experts because they point out that a lot of the spending on this is private companies. It's not the government.
It is private companies.
We're going to pay
and by the way, it's not a reform calculation. Sorry, Sarah. This is an IFG calculation, which is what Nigel Farage said. I was at that press conference where he stood up and he said, this is the Institute for Government that's come up with this number. Now, the Institute for Government, I called them that afternoon, they said that that is a total spend across the economy, most of which, as Kevin says, is private money. So that is not money the government can save by scrapping.
And we can argue about what exactly the figure is. The point
that's not exact. That's a major hole in this very expensive promise that we're talking about.
Hold on. That's a major income to scrap those projects. The other projects that we've talked about quite clearly, hold on, you deport, you get rid of the illegal immigrant, the foreign national offenders in our jails. Whoa, gone. You know,
but 50 billion to 80 billion pounds for
you get rid of
one
the
of your
illegal
policies
immigrants here in the country that are costing £46,000 a year each. Whoa, millions.
And your major way
in.
to pay for that is you said 220. You said £220 billion saved by scrapping net zero projects. That's a huge number.
It is.
Will you admit that most of that number is not government spending, so is not there for the government to save?
I'm not going to admit that at all, because the point is we are saying to you, look at that area. That is an area of huge income.
But it's not £220 billion of government spending, is it?
I can't argue with whether it's 220.
It's not. No one thinks it is.
The point is, it's a huge amount of money to come in. You can argue about these figures. The fact is, the policy
I need to bring in,
is clear.
Let's bring in Sarah.
Sarah, I want to give you another opportunity since you love the limelight so much. Your leader, Richard Tice, talked about cutting and scrapping 35% of government spending. Now, that is the equivalent of the entire Department for Defence, NHS and Education. How are you going to pay for that?
What I think you're referring to is we said by scrapping certain woke projects, DEI projects, over a 5-year period, we could save £30 billion. You know, the point is you're all in denial about some of the waste that is happening. Our Doge teams are going into councils.
£30 billion isn't...
Our Doge teams are going into councils and we're going to save millions. Only Reform is brave enough to say, right, we've got to stop, enough is enough, money is being wasted left, right and centre. We have to recalculate our priorities as a country, decide where we're going to spend our money.
Okay. So, and Kira's absolutely right. The point is on net zero, it's not paid for by taxpayers. So it's paid for by consumers and private businesses. So there's no saving there you can return to other parts of the system. But I can ask you a question. You voted yesterday on the planning bill, which I look after, for 150,000 social homes we built every year. How much does that cost? How much does that cost? And how are you going to pay for it? Because my calculation is £20 billion a year.
The point is, how are Labour going to pay for it? They're in government.
No, you voted for it.
No, they're in government.
They didn't vote for it, you voted for it.
The point is we all... teenager. That is really offensive and really rude. And you can say that because you know that we are now representing the views of the people in this country.
No, Sarah, you've literally just talked over me every single time. You've told me I've had my say.
I haven't talked over you.
Yes, and when I ask a question...
We know. Kevin's just asked me a question. We know we need housing in this country. It is a priority.
This is not grown-up politics.
Angela Rayner has promised all of these houses. Well, where are they? Have they started? How are we going to build them? Do we have the...
Well, it does take some time to get started.
But do we have the people and the resources to actually put these houses up? Where's that workforce coming from?
Well, that's all good questions.
Well, I can tell you where that workforce used to come from.
Those are all good questions, but you can answer the question, where are you going to find the £20 billion a year for affordable housing, for social housing? You voted for yesterday. You've got to have a responsible approach to actually your tax and your spend. Those figures have got to add up, Sarah. I'm afraid the ones I look at from your party, they do not.
No, I think it's too easy because you're both so afraid of what Reform is saying. We are saying, let's get our priorities right. Let's cut waste spending. Let's cut spending that's not a priority. And let's get spending into houses. Let's get spending into defence.
OK, Sarah, there will be people watching this who do feel that there is a lot of waste when it comes to government spending.
Absolutely.
And isn't it the case that Reform UK they're speaking to that?
They're speaking to it, but I have to say that they're not speaking the truth, as we've already heard from Kieran and from Kevin.
You think there aren't cuts that can be made?
There are always, I think, efficiencies that can be made. I know that the Prime Minister has talked about use of AI when it comes to technology in the NHS. That's not anything new.
But what about some of the things the state does?
When the state does, I think that there is the silos, for me, is what actually is some of the most wasteful things, where we see replications of the different departments doing exactly the same things and not working together. That's part of what the missions is trying to change the way that government thinks, the way that government works together and be much more efficient. But when it comes to this whole kind of Doge anti-EDI, and if you're going to be patriotic about it, it's equality, diversity and inclusion, not DEI. You know, Elon Musk has just stomped out of the White House with the tail between his legs because he said exactly the same things that you're saying, Sarah, to people.
But isn't the
and
problem
wasn't able to find those savings
you are
at
attacking
all.
Reform for not having funded spending pledges.
No,
and yet yesterday Rachel Reeves did exactly that herself.
I just asked a genuine question. The leader of their party had said, we're going to cut government by 35%. And that is huge. That's 3 departments at least. I mean, which ones are we going to cut? Which ones are we going to cut?
Let's just have Kevin have a word, please.
I mean, I thought what Nigel Farage said is 5% of government spending. But that's about 10 times the amount that's been saved through Elon Musk's approach in the US, and even that's caused huge problems because you've.
But do you think there is room for?
Of course there is
trimming,
of course. But to say you can suddenly save, you know, £350 billion a year, which I think the figure has come from Reform, is just not achievable.
But do your constituents, do they like what they hear about cutting government spending?
Of course they do. Of course we want to save waste.
Sarah, hold on.
I realise that. That's why we're all doing these jobs, Sarah. We all want to make sure that money's spent more efficiently. We want taxes to be lower, government to be more efficient, of course. And there is definitely a case to argue in terms of productivity in the public sector since the pandemic. That needs to improve. What Labour did, I'm afraid, they settled the pay claims with the unions back last year, were there any strings attached in terms of productivity improvements. That was a huge mistake.
And we're going to hear a lot tomorrow about productivity, Sarah, aren't we? Is your government doing enough on productivity?
40,000 extra appointments a week because we settled the junior doctor strike. I don't think anyone's complaining about that.
Doesn't
mean giving the NHS more money without asking for productivity improvements.
I think productivity isn't just about the carrot and the stick. It's also about some of the things that we're talking about later on around shared parental leave, around terms and conditions rather than just pay, and actually what makes people more efficient. Some people will work more efficiently from home, and yet this has been something that people say, oh, you can't work from home. But ultimately, I think it's about looking at what will make people more productive, and productivity before COVID was actually at an all-time low as well. So I think we need to look at the way of world of work and how it's changed and how we can actually make us more productive as a country.
One of the problems Labour has got, there's not a single person in their cabinet who's ever started and run a business. That's the problem. So they don't know how to negotiate properly, and that was a huge mistake. I asked Alistair Campbell this last year, would you have settled those pay claims at face value without any productivity improvements in your time? Absolutely not.
When it comes to negotiations, you've just said the trade unions did a good job. There's a load of trade unionists within there.
OK, we'll come back to that in a second. I just want to say that tomorrow we're on air from 11:15 right through until 3 o'clock for the Chancellor's spending review, where we will hear a lot more of this kind of thing. Join us for full coverage of the statement, as well as expert analysis from the BBC's political and economic editors. I'll be speaking to a Treasury Minister, and we'll also be hearing from the opposition parties. So do join me then. I want to move on to something that's happened in the last hour or so, which is that Reform UK have announced that they have a new chairman, who is David Bull. That's after the surprise departure of Zia Youssef last week. Let's hear what the party leader Nigel Farage and the new chairman had to say.
Zia's done a phenomenal job, but so much of what he's had to do has been in the office in London. We are dividing responsibilities within the party. We've got a new head of operations. We're going to have a new head of Treasury very shortly. And our new chairman, Dr. David Bull, known to me, we served together in the European Parliament for a period of time.
The key for me with this party is we have grown it from the ground up. This is a grassroots party. It is through the strength, determination, hard work of all those people around the country who've been out and about canvassing, delivering, leafleting and setting up those market stalls.
Sarah, we haven't spoken to you since that happened. We were all sitting here last week when you did your question. Zia Youssef, the last chairman, he quit after you asked that question in the House of Commons. He said that the decision to ask the Prime Minister whether there should be a ban on the burqa was dumb. He has since said that he was very exhausted. He's returned to the party, but not in that role. First of all, it was your first Prime Minister's question. Why did you ask that question? Do you think that was a priority for your constituents?
I think the point is we need to open the debate. So where my constituency now has an awful lot of illegal immigrants, an awful lot of people come in and tell me how threatened they feel just in their own environment. And I've talked a lot already about the HMOs we have with illegal immigrants in, the illegal immigrants in the migrant hotel. So, yes, that was born out
But what's that got to do with the burqa?
So because of people just generally being threatened in this country, feeling threatened in this country. And also, the other key point about my question, it was twofold. It's about cultural integration. Keir Starmer talked about the island of strangers that we're turning into. Well, in my view, wearing a burqa, or in fact any kind of face covering like that, is a barrier to integration. So that was the first reason for asking that question.
So is it Reform Party policy?
It's not Reform Party policy, but
would you like it to be?
I would, yes. Right. And the point is, as an MP, is the House of Commons is there to create debate. And do you know what I was most disgusted with was the fact that Keir Starmer would not even answer that question. He wouldn't give me an answer, and he was rude, just like you've been rude, because you don't like what we're saying.
Just to go back to your question last week, you said it was in the interest of public safety.
Yes.
The statistics are, British Future, the think tank, thinks that between 3,000 and 5,000 Muslim women wear the burqa. So it's not a huge proportion of Muslim women. Why is it a threat to public safety?
Do you know, can I just say to you, after I'd raised that question, a policeman stopped me and said, thank you for raising these issues. Because how do they do their job? How do they know who the terrorists are? We know that they're male terrorists put burqas on to be in disguise. Now, the point is, I'm not saying that happens all the time, of course I'm not. The point is, it's just another barrier to the police doing their job. And we need to feel safe in this country. I feel very strongly that if you want to come and live in this country, you live by our culture, and we will respect yours. But when it becomes a barrier to do with cultural integration, you know, you can't on the one hand complain that there's not cultural integration and then the other hand support a
But does
barrier
cultural
like
integration
that.
mean that everyone has to be the same? Or
Of course it doesn't.
Is there room for difference?
I know from areas I've worked in the past and my experience in public life that where you have such a barrier, how can you integrate? It's a massive cultural difference where women are... It's a huge misogynistic symbol. In this country, we're about democracy. We're about people being able to do what they want to do, not being told what to wear by their husbands.
Sarah, you're the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for British Muslims. What do you make of the need for a debate about the burqa?
Slight irony there. Sarah talking about husbands not being telling their wives what to wear, but quite happy with the state telling women what to wear. I don't think that's where we should be. Zaya Youssef called it dumb. I would say it's dangerous and disingenuous, if I'm honest, the way that PMQ was phrased. Dangerous because less than a year ago we saw riots in our streets because of dog whistle politics, such as what we heard just then. We saw mosques attacked. We saw people scared. People that I know, my friends, constituents of mine in Luton, that were absolutely terrified to even go out because of that sort of debate and the tone of that debate. And secondly, I'd say it's disingenuous for all the points that Vicky's just raised around safety. You couched that PMQ in terms of safety. If you were talking about safety and face coverings, why not ask the question about balaclavas instead of burqas? I haven't finished. I haven't finished. I haven't finished. If it was genuinely about public safety, why not ask the question about balaclavas rather than burqas? There does seem to be a certain type of person that you seem to be very scared of. And I don't really understand that the statistics don't back that up, as we have heard, in terms of the numbers of people being robbed or the places being robbed or people being stabbed. The majority of those will be people with face coverings other than burqas.
And what about cultural integration? Do you think it aids cultural integration when you have women walking around?
Do you know what I
think
aids cultural integration is education. Education aids cultural integration and understanding.
And speaking the language?
Speaking with
what
people.
do you think? Do you think people should all speak English if they're going to integrate in our culture?
Well, my mother came to this country when she was 19 years old to work in the NHS. And yes, she did speak English, but her English has got better as it's gone on. She saved multiple lives and worked in the hospital, as have many immigrants that have come here to this country.
But how many women are not allowed to speak English because they're kept away from our society?
A large number of people and a lot of people that were on English ESOL courses that were cut under the previous government, which actually did enable people to learn English, were women. And I think it's a retrograde step that we saw that, because if we're going to talk about barriers, we should be talking about barriers to safety, barriers to services, barriers to integration, yes, genuine integration, which is actually understanding one another's cultures, not forcing one upon the other.
Sarah, what about the question about other countries like Denmark who have brought in such a ban?
There are many European countries that
France is slightly different because they've done it for secular reasons, but Denmark's not done it for
There are many other countries in Europe that haven't done it, and I think
there are many that have, and that was the question.
And the irony here is that Reform are asking to follow Europe's lead, and actually I think we would be they're the outliers. Denmark is the outlier on this. We as a country have always believed in freedom of religion and belief, and unless I'm told otherwise, I think that should stay.
Now, let's not leave Kevin out of this discussion.
No,
Kemi Badenoch gave her thoughts in the Telegraph over the weekend. She said bosses should have the right to ban staff from wearing burqas and other face coverings in the workplace. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I was a candidate for Dewsbury prior to being a Member of Parliament for Thirsk and Malton, and that's one of the most divided communities we have in this country, and there's many others like it. And there is a problem, there's no question about it. So I think just to be in denial that there is some cultural separation happening in our towns and cities across the UK is wrong. And I think we need to have a proper debate about it. I agree with that. What Kemi said, it's not just about the burqa, it's about a number of different issues that we need to look at to make sure there's a proper cultural integration. I don't think it's right that cultures live separately within our own towns. I think Sarah Poshin saying that people feel threatened is probably the wrong word. I think people feel isolated. Those communities, if you live in a lot of those communities, in West Yorkshire, which I know well, and East Lancashire, people in those communities don't recognise those communities from where they were born and brought up. And I think there's a real problem with that, one we have to deal with. There has to be a message that we have a strong British culture in the UK, and people come to the country or want to live here, we should adopt those kind of cultures.
Kieran, do you think this is becoming much more part of the political debate? We know that Keir Starmer obviously made his speech, didn't he, talking about an island of strangers. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, I think there's two different things. I mean, I think Keir Starmer's speech was to reflect some of the concerns, was trying to reflect some of the concerns that Labour have been hearing for a long time about illegal and legal migration. The separate question of whether what Sarah brought up the other day of a face covering ban, or Burka ban as you phrased it, was not on the agenda. It's not on the agenda. It has not been brought up on any doorstep that I've heard of. It has not been part of
Because people are afraid to bring it up.
That's certainly not been the experience that I've had when doing Vox Pops as a journalist. It's not been the experience of any MP I've ever spoken to. I mean, in a way, you did a great job in bringing this onto the agenda, but it certainly wasn't on the agenda before. Let's not pretend this is, a large part of public debate.
But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be on the agenda.
Well, that's a different question. I don't think there was a great clamour among the British public to talk about this.
Look
You
at the
may
reaction
have
it's caused. Everybody's talking about it.
It's
now,
certainly a
so maybe
talker.
it is something we should be talking about.
One question I have, though, I mean, for you and for people who would support this policy is you've talked a lot about, for example, France, which is probably the country with the biggest Muslim population in Europe that's done this. Would you say they're more integrated as a culture than we are, or less?
I just think that, look, if sensible countries like France, like Belgium, like
but
Austria,
has it worked in France?
Have they thought that they've thought this through?
But do you think it's worked? It's been in place for a long time.
They've got their problems in France, and they've got similar problems, and they've also got their own problems, and we've got our problems. I think
but do you think it's made them a more integrated society? Because what you're proposing is a specific fix to a specific problem that you've identified.
I'm talking about two things, aren't I? I'm talking about actually standing up for some of these women who I think are very much treated in a chauvinistic, misogynistic way by having to wear this garment.
A lot of them say that they choose to do so.
Well, that's an interesting one, and we can have a whole programme about that, and I'd love to, by the way, because you get very different views on whether that is actually a thing or is that an easy thing for some people to claim. But the point is, it's also a safety issue, and France has had terrible issues with terrorism, and as have we.
So it hasn't worked then, has
and by the way,
I think that they've had more attacks since that ban came into place than we have.
What I was going to say is, by the way, we have no idea that how many terrorist attacks are foiled on a daily basis by our wonderful, security services. But the point is, we have to do everything we can to keep the people of this country safe on our streets. And I just think, for all the reasons I've talked about, women's issues, safety issues, integration in our society, that this is such a clear sign that has to go. And you can't walk into a bank with a motorcycle helmet on. Why should you walk into a bank with the full face covering on?
What about a face covering for COVID?
That's
right, let's not get down to COVID,
different
Ruth,
issue, yeah.
But it's the same issue.
That was health grounds, yeah.
Sarah, what did you think about Keir Starmer's language when he talked about an island of strangers?
I was very clear. I don't think that reflects necessarily my experience. I live in a really multicultural, really diverse part of the country, and there are points where actually I think Kevin's right. I want to see greater integration. I always want to see greater integration, but that comes from understanding, not othering. And what we're seeing at the moment in this debate is othering, rather than...
But is that what Keir Starmer was doing, do you think?
I think that those words were not the words I would have chosen, not at all. I wouldn't
Are you worried about language inflaming the situation?
I'm a result of multiculturalism. And so when I hear people like Kemi Badenoch or Suella Braverman or anybody even in my own party talk about how it's an experiment gone wrong, I'm going to take that personally, because ultimately I wouldn't be here without it. And I think that there are many benefits to the shared cultures that we have. I see that every day in Luton, whether it is the Gurdwara coming out and feeding people that need food, whether it's the mosque celebrating Eid and inviting people in and having shared community events that we do. I think that we need to see much more of that, and actually a little bit less of the othering, and actually understanding why it is.
So would you rather Keir Starmer didn't use language like that?
It's not words that I would have used, and I think that I was very clear that when that speech was made, that's not the reflection of Britain that I want to see, and actually we can be a bit more hopeful about the sort of country that we are and want to see. And as Kieran said, no one was talking about this before. We could all just talk about, I don't know, the moon being made of cheese and having a debate about that this isn't. We need to be actually dealing with people's real issues. And if it's about safety, let's deal with the real issues around people's safety.
I can't believe that you would compare women's rights and the country and the safety of this country to the moon and some cheese. That just sums Labour up.
But Sarah, how many women have you spoken to about wearing the burqa? Do you speak to women about this? I mean, there's not very many of them, according to them.
I'll tell you what, though,
You can.
No, I
speak to women wearing burqa all the time.
I campaigned hard in Bolton South East years ago, 10 years ago, and when I say you can't, if a woman has got a burqa on and and they're in the streets, you cannot talk to them. They won't talk to you because they're not allowed to talk to you.
That's not
Sarah,
true.
final word on this.
That is totally untrue. And actually, when Kemi says she wouldn't speak to somebody wearing a burqa in a surgery, women can take off their burqa in front of another woman, and that has happened with me. And I just think that when we talk about this, we need to talk about this responsibly, because I don't want to see the repeat of what happened in summer. Maybe you do.
Can I just show one more image, Sarah? The photo that's emerged of you, which I'm sure you've seen, with a mug, and on it is a photo of Keir Starmer, which is him wearing a hijab. Where did that come from? Why did you do that?
Honestly, you probably won't believe me, but you're doing a walk around up and down a market. It was campaigning. Someone thrust a mug into my hand. I saw two-tier Keir and his face, and a snapshot was taken. Actually, that photo was never, ever used publicly. That photo was destroyed as soon as we realised, out of respect, as soon as we realised he was in a burqa, the photo was destroyed. It's been leaked by someone I sacked.
And do you regret doing that, or would you...
Oh, no, it was a bit of fun at the time. Of course I don't. We've got a sense of humour in this country, and actually I still think it's quite funny, but we never used it publicly. That's just come out through, sour grapes. These things happen, but it's a bit of fun, for goodness sake.
We're going to have a final word on a different issue, which is about parental leave. Sarah, you're the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, and there's a report out today saying that current parental leave, basically, it's not fit for purpose. Why not?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think 2 weeks for parental leave is just not long enough. I mean, like myself, I had a C-section. It takes at least 6 weeks to recover from a C-section, and I think the parent needs to be there to support, not just in terms of the baby, but also support recovery for the mother as well. We also heard about how this is not helping self-employed people at all. We heard from loads of self-employed people that didn't take a single day off once their baby was born. That isn't good for a healthy society. It's not good for families, and it's certainly not good for our economy either.
And it also talks about inadequate leave periods for fathers as well. I mean, is that something that you think should be improved?
Been a father 4 times. So
how much time do you have
I was
off?
managed, not very little. I did my work because I was self-employed. I had my own business for 30 years. So, listen, I can quite understand that people have different lives, and that's why we introduced shared parental leave, so there could be that balance between the two parents. But I am very conscious, and we should also always be very conscious about the impacts of any changes in terms of the impacts on business or the taxpayer. If you made changes to parental leave, it would affect one or the other. Businesses right now are under a huge amount of pressure. Business confidence has dropped like a stone since Labour took over. The last thing you need now is more burdens on businesses.
Sarah?
We heard from businesses that are already offering equal pay, equal parental leave, such as Aviva, for example. And the benefits that they saw in terms of staff retention, in terms of reputation, but also in culture within the business themselves. And over the long term, this could save £2.6 billion because we are seeing more women come back into the economy quicker. Now,
think of the small businesses. Think of small businesses.
We've got very little time left.
Aviva is a massive business. It's the small businesses that Labour's attacking. It's increased the national insurance already. How are you going to pay for this? We've lost 100,000 jobs over the last month because of your policy on national insurance. This is going to be another damning blow for small businesses. Do you know what's going to happen? Small businesses are going to start employing people over 50 only so that they don't have to go down this road.
Sarah?
No, I think that most people accept that 2 weeks off for fathers and other parents isn't actually long enough.
How are you going to pay for it?
It really isn't long enough. And what we've seen is that it means that women can get back into the workplace a lot quicker, and we'll be seeing more production within. We talked about productivity. This is one of the areas where we could improve productivity.
Do you think it's likely to happen? Any improvement in parental leave?
I mean, I don't think immediately, kind of for the reasons that Kevin pointed out, which is there's actually a lot of regulatory burden that's just gone on to business communities. So I don't think it'll happen in the short term, but as a father, I wouldn't have minded a bit more than 2 weeks myself.
That's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow from 11:15 with live coverage of the Chancellor's spending review.